Hi, ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad you're able to take a look at this video. As I mentioned previously, I'm going to spend some time with you. We're going to talk about the concept of fair and foul within Act 1. So I have on my computer our online text. You have access to that. Of course, make sure you go through Clever and then type in your user ID and everything on that nature. That red clay is given to you. If for some reason you can't access it, you need some help, I can help you out with that. Or you can just use the No Fear Shakespeare link that I provided for you from this particular week. I believe it's embedded into the calendar, but nonetheless, any version of Shakespeare's Macbeth should work perfectly fine here. So what we're going to do, we'll spend about 5 minutes or so for this particular video. We'll take a look at some of the quotes, some of the textual evidence that I have highlighted over here. And we'll probably stop right about with the three witches with their prophecy here, and then we'll start another video for you. That way you're not getting like a huge 15-minute video here. So let's take a look at the first quote here. The first quote is in Act 1, Scene 1. It's lines 10 and 11. It's the fair and the foul quote. So when we take a look at this, I have some notes over here, and also you notice I have the citation here. The only thing different that you'll need to do if you want to use this quote is make sure that this is in italics. Make sure the word Macbeth or the title Macbeth is in italics. I don't know how to do that for this particular device. So when we look at this fair versus foul concept, as we talked about before, it's a thematic idea. You can also argue it's a motif because it's not just a repeating concept, but rather you have repeating imagery that goes on and on and on here. So you can sort of say it's both, but let's just talk about the general ideas. First and foremost, when we think about fair versus foul or fair and foul, it's what I talked about in the last video, which is this idea that things that are good maybe appear to be, things that are fair rather appear to be foul, or things that are foul appear to be fair. Another way to look at it is the deceptions that take place, more specifically how people are deceiving one another. And so keep that secondary idea in mind as we take a look at some of the textual evidence. So that's the first piece of textual evidence. Let's look at the next one here. And the next one here, as we see it's still in scene, it's in scene 2, it's lines 54, 55, and it's right over here. And this is the moment, this is taking place right after Macbeth has slaughtered many, many people in the other army. And we find out that one of the people in the other army was actually a traitor. In this particular case, it was the Thane of Cawdor. Now, if you remember, Macbeth eventually is going to get his title. Now, as I talked about with fair versus foul, one way that you can read this is the idea of deception. And so in this case here, this particular man, this Thane of Cawdor, he was deceiving King Duncan into making King Duncan believe that he was actually on King Duncan's side, of course, but in actuality, he betrayed him. So the false loyalty, that's the fair, and then being disloyal, that's the foul portion here. And so this is how we see that fair versus that foul thematic concept developed a little bit more. We also have the idea with the witches themselves, right? So I mentioned about what they said earlier, but we haven't talked about them as individuals here. So this is still in scene 2 is what I'm talking about. But really, you can sort of extrapolate it from scene 1 and scene 2. But let's just talk about the witches themselves. We obviously know that they look disgusting. There's numerous pieces of textual evidence that talk about how they look awful. If you remember, they had beards, among other things, to the point where Banquo was like, oh my goodness, what am I seeing here? But the main thing that we want to think about is the promises that the witches have presented to Macbeth here. So it's good news that Macbeth is going to be king. It's good news that Banquo's children are going to be king. However, these witches, of course, are evil. They're foul, right? They're evil in a variety of ways. We know in scene 1, they're working hand in hand with demons. We also know that they're acting overly cruel towards a woman and her husband who on one level or another offended one of the witches. If you recall, the woman, the wife of the sailor, didn't want to share her chestnuts, I think it was. And so as a result, the witches cast a spell which inevitably caused the sailor to die. And so we see this level of foulness, but yet they're delivering quote unquote fair news, if you will. So again, we have this paradoxical concept of fair versus foul that's taking place. So if we jump over to the next quote, which is at the bottom of this particular page, I think it says 218, and it's in scene 3, right? And so what has happened here in scene 3 is that the witches, they've cast this spell, and then Macbeth and Banquo, they're sort of walking off the battlefield, if you will, and they stumble on the witches. But before they stumble on the witches, Macbeth talks about how the day itself is foul and fair. Now, it's possible he's talking about the weather. It's possible he's talking about how maybe it was, thunder and lightning earlier, but now maybe it's not so much thunder and lightning. But the reality is he's probably talking about the events of the day. We ask ourselves, what was foul about the day? Well, of course, the fact that there was war. Lots of people died. Macbeth had to kill many, many people. More than likely, Macbeth witnessed brothers in arms dying next to him. Maybe some of those people were good friends of his. So that's how it's foul. That's how it's evil. That's how it's bad. How is it fair? Well, it's fair in the sense that the war is over now. The battle is won. Macbeth and King Duncan and Banquo, they are victorious. So that's how it's fair. So again, we come back to this foul and fair, this paradoxical concept how the day is both in a legitimate way. And then last but not least, for this particular video that we're doing, is we want to take a look at the prophecy that's delivered to Macbeth and to Banquo. And when we look at the prophecy, if you notice, each line is broken into a fair portion and then a foul portion, meaning a good portion and a bad portion. Sometimes the foul is first, sometimes the foul is second, but nonetheless, it's two parts. But the other thing to think about is, depending on who hears the prophecy, depends on whether or not the prophecy is fair or foul, or what portion is fair versus foul. But let's sort of take a look at it. So the first portion of the prophecy from the first witch, and this is on line 65, and we're in scene 3 still, says lesser than Macbeth and greater. This, of course, is for Banquo here. So it's foul, meaning bad, that he's lesser than Macbeth. But now it's fair because he's greater than Macbeth. Not so happy. Obviously, that's foul. Yet much happier, that's fair. And then last but not least, it says, thou shalt get kings. Now that's fair. And now shall, and though thou be none, that's foul, of course. So we look at that, both halves of the prophecy is either fair or foul. And as I remarked, depending on who hears this, that depends on whether or not this prophecy is fair or foul. So if, for example, if we hear that he shall get kings, well, that's fair for Banquo, but for Macbeth, not so much. If we hear that he will not be a king, that's foul for Banquo, but for Macbeth, maybe that's fair. So again, when we think about the concept of fair versus foul, once again, we come back to the idea of, don't think of it in isolation. Make sure that you're thinking of it coupled together. Make sure you're thinking of them bound together and how they paradoxically exist together and sort of push away. So I'm going to stop sharing, of course, right now. I'm going to close this video up and look for the second video, and the second video will pick up right where we stopped. Have a great day. Bye now.